Let me tell you a story about a magician. There was once a Prussian conjurer born Friedrich Wilhelm Frickel. Friedrich was orphaned at the tender age of 6, but he proved remarkably resilient despite this tragedy. He taught himself sleight of hand, palming, and other techniques used by close-up magicians. Soon he was performing in cabarets, and by his late teens, his act had evolved into a larger stage show. Billed as a master of higher magic and apparent sorcery, Frickel gained a modest reputation in Germany for his impressive collection of props and his increasingly complex stage illusions. Now, like most magicians of his era, he also wore some wonderfully colorful costumes. By the mid-1800s, the stereotype that the quote-unquote Orient was a place of mystery and magic was firmly established in Europe. And so, magicians leaned into it. Friedrich started performing as Wilhelm Frickel, a variation on his name that he deemed to be more exotic sounding. His stage gear included a red fez, an embroidered vest, and large, puffy harem pants. He was meant to look Turkish, but in one of the earliest drawings of Frickel, he looks a lot more like Disney's Aladdin. I'll post the drawing so you can see for yourself. But in 1842, disaster struck. In the early morning hours of May 5th, a cigar factory in Hamburg caught fire. Soon the flames had spread, and before long, nearly a third of the buildings in the city had been consumed. The so-called Great Fire of Hamburg was a defining moment for the city, but it would prove especially significant for Wilhelm Frickel and ultimately the history of magic. You see, in 1842, Frickel stored all of his stage equipment and costumes in Hamburg. The fire destroyed everything. It had taken him a lifetime to acquire all the items lost in the fire. Some of his stage gear was one of a kind and simply could not be replaced, even if he had the money to do it. But giving up was simply not an option. Frickel was an unschooled orphan. Magic was really the only career path available to him. If he was going to eat, he simply had to keep performing. So he drastically reimagined his act. He took adversity and transformed it into aesthetic. He crafted a new act that was built around the fundamentals of magic. The show would be entirely based on sleight of hand and other close-up magic techniques that he had perfected as a child. There would be little to no stage dressing. There would barely be any props. And since all of Frickel's harem pants and fezzes had been destroyed in the fire, he would take the stage wearing one of the few outfits he still felt was presentable enough to show to an audience, his formal evening wear, which included a coat with tails. The centerpiece of his show was now called the quote-unquote inexhaustible top hat, from which he would pull 200 brass cups. Much to Frickel's surprise, his new approach proved to be quite successful. In fact, this bare-bones magic show was even more popular than his earlier Eastern-themed extravaganzas. Perhaps it was the novelty of his austere approach that intrigued audiences. Or perhaps the sheer skill involved in accomplishing illusions without the help of large props entranced the crowd. What's clear is that other magicians took note. Magic historian Milborn Christopher has pointed out that within a few years, fellow German Karl Hermann had adopted Frickel's style, and he became world famous with his own austere magic show based around sleight of hand techniques. Soon, a French magician would also be performing wearing formal evening wear. That Frenchman was none other than Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, and soon he would be the most famous magician in the world. By the end of the 19th century, a tailored coat and top hat had practically become the standard issue uniform for anyone performing magic on stage. Now, at that time, most historians of the art credited the great Robert Houdin with inventing the look of the modern magician. Vjalba Frickel was almost completely forgotten. Frickel remained a reasonably successful working magician until the mid-1870s, but then he settled into a quiet retirement in his home in a small town outside of Dresden, Germany. He valued his privacy and only performed rarely for charity events after his last big tour in 1872. He did little to cultivate his legacy in those years, and so he faded into obscurity. By the turn of the 20th century, few magicians knew the name Vjalba Frickel, and those that did weren't sure if he was even still alive. That was until magic's fastest rising star became obsessed with the old German master. In 1903, Harry Houdini was touring Europe. While on the continent, Houdini's interest in the history of stage magic became deeper than ever. As it turns out, this is extremely common for magicians and serious magic fans. Magicians often tend to be amateur historians. In fact, many of the best Houdini biographers were themselves once magicians. Kenneth Silverman, who's widely regarded as the best modern Houdini biographer, used to perform magic as the amazing Ken Silvers. Houdini himself would eventually become a historian of magic. Now, Houdini never called himself an historian. Instead, he would present himself as a dedicated amateur intent on busting historical myths. Hey, guys, Houdini might be the spiritual godfather of this podcast. Now, in Houdini's estimation, the biggest myth in the history of magic was the career of his former hero, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. As we discussed in part 1 of this series, Houdini had at one time idolized Houdin. In fact, his name, Houdini, was derived from Houdin. But Houdini became convinced that while Houdin was widely celebrated as a pioneering stage magician, he hadn't actually invented anything. Houdini believed that there was evidence that the French magician had cribbed almost everything from other performers, including his distinctive stage costume. Houdini wanted to revive the memory of the forgotten greats eclipsed by the attention hog Robert Houdin. He believed that Vjalba Frickel was one of these forgotten greats, and so Houdini became intent on finding the old man. In 1903, while touring Germany, he started tracking down leads to see if he could locate Frickel and confirm whether or not the old man was even still alive. He discovered that Frickel was indeed alive and was living quietly with his wife in a Dresden suburb. So when Houdini got the chance to play Dresden, he made time to visit Frickel's house, and he brazenly knocked on the door. He discovered that the Frickels were in no mood to be bothered. The old magician refused to even show his face. Houdini would later write that Frickel's wife eventually popped her head out of a second-story window and told him in no uncertain terms to get lost. But Houdini was persistent, writing, quote, "With that peculiar fervency which comes only when the heart's desire is at stake, I begged that past master of magic would lend a helping hand to one ready to sit at his feet and learn." End quote. It was not enough that day. Houdini was denied an audience. But something he said must have stuck with Frickel, because a few months later, the old magician finally replied to one of Houdini's many letters. Frickel agreed to meet with Houdini the next time he came through Dresden. So, the ecstatic Houdini quickly arranged things so he could play a show in Dresden as soon as possible. After receiving Frickle's letter, Houdini had hoped to be at the magician's home within a week, but forces conspired to delay him. He had business in Berlin and other distractions which kept him from getting to the Frickle household. When Houdini finally arrived, he described the scene like this, quote, "I rang the bell. It echoed through the house with a peculiar shrillness. The air seemed charged with a quality which I presumed was the intense pleasure of realizing my long-cherished hope of meeting the great magician. A lady opened the door and greeted me with the words, 'You are being waited for.' I entered. He was waiting for me indeed, this man who had consented to meet me after vowing that he would never again look into the face of a stranger. And fate had forced him to keep that vow. Viljalba Frickle was dead. The body, clad in the best his wardrobe afforded, all of which had been donned in honor of his expected guest, was not yet cold. Heart failure had come suddenly and unannounced." End quote. So, yeah, Houdini claimed that Viljalba Frickle died at the very moment that Houdini rang his doorbell. That's crazy, right? Like, what are the odds that the very second that Houdini arrived at Frickle's house, the man passed away? Houdini says that the magician's body was still warm when he found him in his drawing room. Now, Houdini recorded this incredible story in his book, The Unmasking of Robert Houdin, which was meant as an exposé of Houdini's former hero. The book presented itself as a bold, if uncomfortable, act of truth-telling. The introduction to that book concludes with this tragic anecdote. Now, the context of that book has lent credence to this story. Houdini was exposing the lies and legends created by Robert Houdin. So surely, everything he reports must be entirely true, right? Houdini wouldn't make up a story about Frickle dying the moment he arrived. Not in this book. Would he? Well, I think maybe he would. Houdini biographers all quickly learn that Harry Houdini should not be treated as a reliable narrator, especially when it comes to entertaining or amazing autobiographical stories. Now, it does seem like Houdini visited the Frickle home. He even took a picture of himself out front. It's also clear that he corresponded with the couple. But arriving at the exact moment of Frickle's death, that seems like a classic Houdini exaggeration. Now, of course, I can't prove this. This is just a hunch I have based on Houdini's track record as a storyteller and a myth maker. Even in a book dedicated to busting myths, I think Houdini couldn't resist giving his Frickle story some added drama. Houdini was a showman, and I don't think that was a part of himself that he could turn off. But of course, this is the magician's art. They build trust so that the deception feels more miraculous. One of Houdini's contemporaries, the magician Carl Germain, once famously said, quote, "Magic is the only honest profession. The magician promises to deceive you, and he does." End quote. I think there's some wisdom in that quote. When you sit down for a magic show, you have essentially consented to being deceived. However, things get murkier once we leave the theater. Did Houdini ever really drop the act? Let's dig into it today on Our Fake History. episode number 169, Who Knows Houdini, Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting at $5 a month or more to get access to an ad-free feed and every other patrons-only extra I currently have on offer. That includes my most recent extra episode, sounding off on the latest Graham Hancock nonsense on Netflix. I get pretty real, a little salty on that one. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, then please consider supporting on Patreon. This week, we are continuing our exploration of the best-known stage magician in history, Harry Houdini. As you have surely already put together, this is part 2 of what is going to be a 3-part series on the famous escape artist. So if you haven't listened to part 1, then I would strongly suggest that you go back and give that a listen now. Back in part 1, I spent some time looking at the fake history of magic that had been conjured by Houdini's one-time hero and namesake, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. We discovered that the great Torini, the magician who sometimes gets credit for being the first performer to saw a woman in half, never actually existed. He was a fictional character cooked up by Robert Houdin to help give himself a more compelling origin story. Nevertheless, Houdin was the inspiration for a young Eric Weiss, who in the early 1890s started performing as Harry Houdini. In the last episode, we unpacked the various myths surrounding Houdini's birth, immigration to America, and childhood in the towns of Appleton, Milwaukee, and New York City. From there, we took a critical look at the story of Houdini and his wife Bess's whirlwind courtship. Bess went to her grave insisting that she met Houdini after he accidentally spilt acid on her dress while he was performing at her high school. She also claimed that they got married on their first date at Coney Island. As we saw, these were all romantic myths. Finally, we looked at the Houdini's early career as a husband and wife variety act. When we last left Houdini and Bess, they were grinding out a meager living playing dime museums and circuses. On top of their magic act, they tried their hand at dance, clowning, acrobatics, and stand-up comedy. Houdini even performed for a stint as a human oddity in a freak show. But the part of the act that first got them noticed was an illusion the Houdinis dubbed metamorphosis. The blink-and-you'll-miss-it trunk escape was a truly phenomenal bit of stage magic that got Houdini and Bess their first ever bits of positive press. Now, the great challenge when trying to pick apart the life story of Harry Houdini is the difficulty parsing the verifiable facts from the many legends that he created about his life. As I mentioned in the last episode, one Houdini biographer once wrote that separating fact from fiction when examining Houdini's life story was like, quote, chewing through a coconut, end quote. Well, today, we keep chewing. When we left off, Houdini and Bess were just on the precipice of breaking through as a popular stage act. So let's pick back up with the Houdinis and see how these tireless dime museum performers were rocketed to fame at the turn of the 20th century. The year 1899 is often pointed to as the year that Houdini became a star. That was the year that he and Bess finally got their big break. After spending 5 years grinding in circuses and dime museums, they finally caught the attention of Martin Beck, one of the most important theater owners and vaudeville promoters in America. Beck essentially controlled the vaudeville circuit west of the Mississippi, although he also had theaters in Chicago and New York. He was the man behind the Orpheum Theaters, the grandest being the Orpheum in San Francisco. Now, perhaps it's worth taking a minute to explain vaudeville. Vaudeville was a term that in the late 19th century applied to a style of popular entertainment in America that had evolved out of the English music hall tradition. Vaudeville started out as rowdy tavern entertainment, but in the late 19th century, promoters looking to court larger audiences did their best to transform the vaudeville acts into something a bit more family-friendly. These were variety shows that featured a series of 10 to 15-minute acts ranging from singers to acrobats, comedians to plate spinners, ventriloquists to magicians. Now, vaudeville wasn't considered high art at the time. In fact, some of the more prudish commentators of the day believed that this kind of light entertainment was corrupting America. Because, something's always corrupting America, right? But it was massively popular. By the turn of the century, vaudeville theaters were doing a brisk business. If you wanted to make it big as a magician, you wanted to be performing on a vaudeville stage. It was Houdini's good fortune that while performing in a tavern in St. Paul, Minnesota, Martin Beck just happened to wander in. Beck was immediately taken by Houdini's unique way of challenging his audience. Houdini would crow that he could escape from any pair of handcuffs in the world. Then he would challenge any member of the audience to go out and find a pair of handcuffs that they believed was strong enough to hold him. If they returned the next day with the cuffs, Houdini would escape from them right then and there on stage. Beck was intrigued, and so the next day he returned with a few pairs of handcuffs. Houdini managed to escape from every pair. The handcuff act was something that the Houdinis had developed starting around 1895. It began as a twist on the metamorphosis. But instead of Houdini having his hands tied with rope, Harry would be handcuffed before he was secured in the metamorphosis trunk. Noticing that the handcuffs got a big reaction from the audience, Houdini started doing all sorts of handcuff escapes on stage. Now, Houdini would later claim that he was the first magician to use handcuffs in his act, but that wasn't entirely true. There were at least a handful of magicians in the 1890s doing handcuff escapes, but Houdini really did turn it into an art form. Now, one thing I found really interesting is that Houdini always performed these escapes behind a curtain. And that kind of blew my mind. I had always pictured him escaping from handcuffs in front of the audience. What happened instead is that he would be manacled in front of the crowd and then would retreat to a little curtained room called the Ghost Box. Then he would emerge with the handcuffs removed. This was done so people couldn't see the secret he employed to slip the manacles. Now, it's kind of amazing that audiences back then had the patience to literally stare at a curtain and let their imaginations do the work. But luckily, they usually didn't have to wait too long, as Houdini could slip most manacles in a matter of minutes. In 1896, Houdini and Bess also started using a new promotional tactic, where they would go to the police station in whatever town he happened to be performing in. Once there, Houdini would challenge the local cops to put him in a pair of handcuffs that they thought he could not escape from. Of course, he always made sure a local newspaper reporter was also present to write about the event. Without fail, Houdini always managed to free himself from the strongest handcuffs in town. Now, it seems like he did his first police challenge in Gloucester, Massachusetts, but it became a hallmark of a tour that he and Bess did of Atlantic Canada in 1896. There, the magician made the papers by besting the police in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then again in St. John, New Brunswick. It's also worth noting that Houdini would later claim that it was while he was in St. John that he saw his first straitjacket. In 1908, Houdini would write that while in St. John, he had the opportunity to tour what was at the time called the Provincial Lunatic Asylum. Houdini claimed that he was invited to the asylum by one Dr. James Steeves. While touring the facility, he saw one of the patients in a padded room restrained in a straitjacket. Houdini wrote that the man was, quote, rolling about and straining each and every muscle in a vain attempt to get his hands over his head, and striving in every conceivable manner to free himself from his canvas restraint. Houdini was immediately inspired, and soon he had incorporated straitjacket escapes into his act. But there's reason to believe that this never happened. Local St. John historian Harold Wright has pointed out that there's no record of Houdini meeting Dr. Steeves or visiting the asylum in 1896. In later years, when Houdini was legitimately famous, it was not uncommon for him to get invitations like this. But in 1896, he was basically an unknown magician, so it seems unlikely that he would be given a special tour of the asylum by its director. Now, interestingly, Houdini historian Kenneth Silverman points out that when Houdini was at the St. John police station, he escaped from a device called the, quote, maniac cuff and belt, end quote. This was a special pair of leather mittens locked to a leather belt that had been designed to restrain asylum patients. The presence of this device suggests that maybe Dr. Steeves or some other asylum official was present and extended an invitation to Houdini. Or it could also mean that Houdini took the real detail of having escaped from a device designed for asylum patients in St. John and then transformed it into the straitjacket in later tellings. As far as we can tell, Houdini did his first straitjacket escape in 1899, some 3 years after he allegedly first saw the device in St. John. Now that's a somewhat suspicious time gap. But why change the story? Well, the straitjacket would become an essential part of Houdini's act for decades. In fact, it was one of the few escapes that was not performed behind a curtain. Houdini would dramatically roll around in front of his audience and let them witness his skill in escaping the straitjacket. It's entirely possible that he invented the asylum tour story because it better set the scene for his act. It also gave one of his most iconic pieces of stage gear an interesting backstory. Anyway, what's clear is that by the time Martin Beck saw Houdini perform in St. Paul in early 1899, escapes were now a big part of his act. A few days after Houdini freed himself from Martin Beck's handcuffs, the vaudeville impresario sent a telegram to the magician saying, quote, "You can open Omaha March 26th, $60. We'll see act and we'll make a proposition for all next season." End quote. Simple as that, Houdini had been given the opportunity to open a show on a big vaudeville stage in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, we don't have many details from that particular show, but clearly he didn't disappoint. After that night, Beck made Houdini an offer to appear as an act in his theaters all across America. And what's more, Beck would personally manage the Houdinis and help them with publicity. Harry agreed, and he and Bess got to work. Within the year, they had played some of America's best stages in Kansas City, Chicago, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Denver, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And very quickly, Houdini became one of the most talked about acts on the vaudeville circuit. The short 15-minute magical sets played well to Houdini's style. The metamorphosis remained a staple of the show, but Houdini started incorporating more escapes that could be done quickly. He also introduced his famous needle swallowing illusion. Now, this was actually a very old piece of magic, where the magician would apparently swallow a handful of needles and then a piece of thread. He would then let members of the audience examine his mouth, and finally, he would pull the thread out of his mouth, strung with the needles that he had apparently just swallowed. Magicians Penn and Teller still perform this trick. I'll post a YouTube video of Teller doing the needles so you can see it for yourself. Now, as most magic writers like to point out, the needles is a fairly easy piece of magic to accomplish. A good birthday magician can do the needles. But Houdini really made it his own. It also fit well with his act, which was becoming increasingly about danger and his own athletic skill. This may have been Houdini's great innovation as a magician. You see, the previous generation of magicians had been deeply influenced by the spiritualist movement. Now, we've talked about spiritualism on this show before. As you might remember, the spiritualists were people who claimed that they were able to communicate with ghosts through seances or other means of contact. Some spiritualists claimed that they could receive messages from beyond, or that ghosts could help them see the future. Some spiritualists even claimed that they could produce ghostly phenomenon. Spirits would appear on command, objects would levitate, instruments would start playing without being touched by human hands. Now, spiritualism would eventually become a bit of an obsession for Houdini in his later life, as he went on a personal crusade to expose spiritualists as charlatans, and we will be getting to that later in this series. But in his early career, Houdini, like most magicians, incorporated spiritualism into his act. Houdini and Bess would use spiritualist techniques to do a mind-reading act. The magic on stage was presented as the working of the spirits. But by the time that Houdini hit the vaudeville stages, he presented his magic quite differently. He didn't claim that he performed his magical feats because he had the aid of mysterious ghosts. Instead, he presented all his feats of magic simply as acts of great skill. Houdini could escape from cuffs because he was smart, talented, and could clearly do things with his body that most people could not do. He could do these things because he was a great athlete. Kenneth Silverman has pointed out that Houdini tapped into another huge movement sweeping America at that time, the physical fitness movement, or as Silverman calls it, quote, the religion of strenuosity, end quote. I love that. The religion of strenuosity. In the late 19th century, there was a worry that Americans and Europeans were becoming too soft as a result of comfortable modern living. So a new emphasis was placed on exercise and athletics. This was the era that gave us the modern Olympics, after all. By 1899, Houdini was presenting himself as an athlete magician. His magic and escapes were presented as feats of human greatness. Ghosts or Eastern mysticism were not needed to explain the miraculous things you saw on stage during a Houdini performance. Houdini told his audience that he was just fast, strong, and able to manipulate his body with a level of precision that was impossible for most. Of course, this was all just part of the illusion. But it's significant that Houdini was telling his audience a different story about his magic. Now, clearly, Houdini's stage act had become quite good by the time he was touring the vaudeville stages. But his real talent may have been in publicity. Many of the publicity gimmicks that Houdini developed while touring Canada were amped up during his 1899 vaudeville run. In particular, Houdini continued to challenge police departments to lock him in whatever manacles they could get their hands on to see if he could be held. Time and time again, Houdini would free himself from the fetters and get some free press from the local papers. Before a run of dates at the Orpheum in San Francisco, one of Beck's biggest theaters, Houdini invited police officers from around the country to join him in San Francisco and do their utmost to constrain him. Records show that over 400 police officers from around America came to San Francisco for the challenge. They festooned Houdini in over a dozen supposedly unbreakable pairs of handcuffs and other restraints. Houdini escaped in just 7 minutes. The California papers went wild, all but ensuring that his run at the Orpheum would be a massive success. But this was just the start of a media circus that was being drummed up on the West Coast. Not long after his triumph over 400 police officers, a piece ran in the San Francisco Examiner titled Exposé of Houdini's Trunk and Handcuff Trick by one Professor Benzon. The piece was then reprinted a few days later in the Los Angeles Chronicle. Professor Benzon was an English magician who claimed that Houdini's escapes were actually laughably simple. In the article, he pointed out that the vast majority of handcuffs could be opened with 3 basic key designs. The magician need only to hide the keys on his person, and voila, an easy escape could be made. Now, Houdini wasn't about to take this lying down. A few days after the article was published, he fired back with his own article. Houdini pointed out that he had escaped from all sorts of manacles, many of which were not conventional handcuffs. And even if he did have keys, where was he hiding them, and how could he reach them once he was bound by his policeman volunteers? To prove that he wasn't using any of the techniques described by Benzon, Houdini proclaimed that he would redo the challenge, but this time he would do it completely naked. If Benzon thought he was hiding keys, then he would strip down to nothing to satisfy his critics. And so, a few days later, he did exactly that. Now, in 1899, this was a bit too risque for the theater audience, but he did get completely naked in front of 12 police officers at the San Francisco Police Department and was once again locked up in their best handcuffs. The naked Houdini freed himself in only 5 minutes. This naked escape was eaten up by the papers. Soon, Houdini was doing escapes in the nude wherever he did a show. He would turn up at a police station, strip down to nothing, and challenge the cops to restrain him. In fact, the naked act became a huge part of Houdini's image. Houdini had himself photographed a number of times nearly nude and bound in chains. Some of the most famous pictures of Houdini are from this period. Probably the best known picture of Houdini is the one where he's hunched over, bound in chains, wearing only a jockstrap. These images and the newspaper stories of Houdini escaping in the nude were instrumental in his rise as an American celebrity. The nearly nude photographs, which were used as publicity shots, emphasized Houdini's muscular physique. It helped promote his image as the athlete magician. And let's be real, even in 1899, sex sold. Houdini's muscular, bare-chested image was sexy. Now, no one wrote about it like that back then, but Houdini was good-looking, and he was showing some flesh. It seems silly to overlook the sex appeal of the whole thing. But here's the best part of this. This episode often gets presented as Houdini taking Professor Benzon's lemons and making publicity lemonade. That's how Kenneth Silverman presented this episode in his 1996 Houdini biography. which, if you haven't already noticed, has been one of my key sources. But since 1996, new research has shown that Professor Benzon was actually in cahoots with Houdini. Joe Posnanski has argued that Houdini and Benzon collaborated behind the scenes to drum up their rivalry in the press. Houdini may have even written the original expose article himself and simply had Benzon plant it in the California papers. Now, this makes perfect sense because Benzon's original expose was so two-dimensional. It didn't truly expose Houdini, and it teed him up perfectly to get more free press and to perform one of his more memorable public stunts. What I love about this is that Houdini had us all fooled for over 100 years. His great rivalry in the press was just an illusion. Houdini's first year with Martin Beck on the vaudeville circuit was capped with a series of public stunts that would solidify his status as one of America's best-known performers. These were Houdini's famous jailbreaks. The jailbreaks were a natural progression from the handcuff challenges. Houdini would turn up at a police station, he would have the men lock him in a holding cell, and then he would escape. He first attempted this in April of 1900 in Chicago. After being searched by a Chicago PD detective, Houdini was led into a cell secured with 2 state-of-the-art locks. Houdini freed himself in a mind-bending 3 minutes. A week later, he repeated the feat in Kansas City, except this time, of course, he did it naked, handcuffed, and gagged with tape, just in case he was smuggling keys in his mouth. Papers across America ran stories about these escapes. These clever publicity stunts were then amplified by Martin Beck's promotional machine. Add to that a relentless touring schedule and the fact that Houdini's stage act was legitimately quite good, and you had a recipe for a huge success. Houdini signed his first contract with Martin Beck in March of 1899. By June of 1900, he was arguably one of the most famous people in America. It had been one hell of a year. The next step was to take his act across the pond. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll see how Houdini fared in Britain and continental Europe. Between 1899 and 1900, Harry Houdini went from being an obscure magician eking out a living playing cheap circuses to being hailed as one of America's greatest entertainers. He was now billed as the Handcuff King. Now, you may have noticed that I've started to refer to Houdini more singularly and spoken less about the Houdinis as a husband and wife act. One of the consequences of the 1899 publicity stunts and the vaudeville tour was that more of the attention was put on Harry. After 1900, Houdini was promoted more as an individual. The husband and wife routine was dropped. Bess was still part of the act, but she became more of a magician's assistant and lost her equal billing. But in 1900, after finally making a splash in America, the next move for Houdini was to bring his act to Europe. Martin Beck arranged through a promoter named Richard Pitriot for Houdini to have dates booked in London, Paris, and Berlin. But this ended up being a fiasco. after a long steamer journey across the Atlantic, Houdini and Bess arrived in London, only to discover that nothing had been booked for them. Richard Pitriot had completely misled them. Houdini was incensed, as he and Bess would now have to do the hard work of booking their own shows to justify the expense of traveling to Britain. Remember, this was 1900. Crossing the ocean was no small thing. Houdini was also brutally seasick. Bess would tell a colorful tale of having to tie Houdini to a bedpost after he threatened to jump overboard to end his queasiness. Turns out the only thing he couldn't escape from was one of Bess's knots. Now, once again, this seems like one of Bess and Harry's colorful exaggerations, but who knows? Once in London, Houdini came to the upsetting realization that no one in England had ever heard of him. News of his exploits on the vaudeville circuit stateside hadn't really made it across the Atlantic. So in Britain, he was faced with the task of having to prove himself all over again. Now this is where we get another colorful Houdini anecdote. The story goes that Houdini, desperate for a gig, finally managed to get a meeting with C. Dundas Slater, the owner of the Alhambra, one of London's finest theaters for performing magic. Despite Houdini's claims that he was actually quite famous in America, Slater was reticent to book a magician that he'd never heard of. But Houdini would not take no for an answer, and he started reeling off his many accomplishments, including the sensation he caused after besting police departments across America. Now, Slater had apparently booked another magician a few weeks earlier who had also used handcuffs in his act. That magician had totally bombed. But being a sporting fellow, Slater made Houdini a bet. He told the magician that if he could go to Scotland Yard and escape from a pair of their proper British handcuffs, then he would give him a booking. Of course, Houdini took him up on this immediately and insisted that they head right away to Scotland Yard headquarters. When they arrived, we're told that they met with Lieutenant William Melville, the superintendent of Scotland Yard's special branch. Now, Melville thought this was all a little silly, but he agreed to play along. He escorted Houdini to a large pillar and had him wrap his arms around it. He then clamped on a pair of solid English derby cuffs and allegedly quipped, "This is how we treat Yanks who come over here and get themselves into trouble. We'll be back for you." End quote. He then turned and walked away, but was stopped when Houdini said, "Wait, I'll go with you." Melville turned around to discover that America's Handcuff King had already freed himself. Slater was so impressed that he immediately booked Houdini for a 2-week run at the Alhambra, which was then extended to 6 weeks after ticket sales exceeded expectations. And so it was that Houdini conquered London. It's a great story, and one that Houdini would dine out on years later. But there are a lot of reasons to doubt that this ever happened. First, we can safely set aside the part of the story concerning the bet with C. Dundas Slater. Kenneth Silverman has demonstrated that Houdini got his break with Slater after he performed a private show for the theater owner on June 27th, 1900. Now, this date is significant because Harry Houdini's alleged visit to Scotland Yard was supposed to have taken place on June 14th. Houdini definitely did not get his gig at the Alhambra because of anything that happened at Scotland Yard. Now, there is solid evidence that Houdini went to Scotland Yard and visited their so-called Black Museum. On June 14th, Houdini signed the guest book. Researchers have found his signature. But beyond that, there's no evidence that Houdini met with William Melville or was handcuffed to a post. One of the big reasons many people are skeptical of this story is that there's nothing in the British press from this time commenting on the event. Houdini never went to a police station without a newspaper man in tow. If he was going to challenge Scotland Yard, he would have made sure that the press was watching. Now, the tale that he rushed to Scotland Yard to settle a bet with Slater helps explain why the press wasn't present, but we know that there probably was no bet with Slater. Once Houdini started performing at the Alhambra, then all sorts of Houdini news and reviews start popping up in the London press. But never once do they mention that the magician had just recently bested the detectives of Scotland Yard. However, there is one suggestive review of a Houdini show where the one and only Superintendent William Melville of Scotland Yard is quoted calling Houdini a, quote, absolute miracle, end quote. But there's nothing in the article about Houdini escaping cuffs at police headquarters. I just can't believe that if the story was true, Houdini would have let the London press sleep on it. Houdini expert John Cox, who runs the encyclopedic Houdini website wildaboutharry.com, has discovered that the first time that this story appears anywhere is actually in an American newspaper about a year after Houdini's run at the Alhambra. That article also tells a much less dramatic version of the story. That article explains that Houdini took a tour of Scotland Yard and was told by a tour guide that a particular pair of handcuffs were, quote-unquote, impossible to remove. The article explains that Houdini requested that his guide, quote, lock the handcuffs on his wrists. Then he turned his back and succeeded in getting them off in a couple of minutes, end quote. So this article at the very least confirms that the story became more elaborate as the years went on. In the earliest version of the story, he's just wowing a tour guide. By the time the story appears in Houdini's first proper biography, he's settling a bet with Slater, winning a booking at the Alhambra, and amazing a superintendent of Scotland Yard. But there's even reason to doubt the more muted version of the story that appears in that 1901 article. Cox has pointed out that that article was almost certainly written by Houdini himself. Houdini regularly sent articles back to the United States while he was touring Europe to keep his name in the papers. This was likely one of those articles. So it seems like the Scotland Yard story was yet another myth invented by Houdini. Now, it might sound like another harmless bit of self-promotion, but I've lingered on this particular Houdini myth because it forms the germ of one of the most controversial Houdini theories to emerge in the last 20 years. This is the idea that Houdini lived a double life as a spy. This idea was first presented in a 2006 book called The Secret Life of Houdini by William Kalish and Larry Sloman. Kalish and Sloman argued that Houdini may have been working for the American Secret Service as early as 1899, and then went on to spy for the British after arriving in England in 1900. The authors of The Secret Life of Houdini point out that when Harry Houdini was challenging police officers from around America, he got to know a few officers who were members of something called the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, or the IACP. One of the most high-profile members of the IACP was the chief of the U.S. Secret Service, a man named John Wilkie. Now, interestingly, Wilkie was an amateur magician, and Sloman and Kalish discovered evidence that Wilkie even recruited magicians to work as secret agents. From there, the authors speculate that through his contact with the IACP, Houdini may have hooked up with the magic lover John Wilkie and was brought in as a spy. Now, honestly, that doesn't seem like a lot of evidence that Houdini ever did any spying for the Secret Service, but sure, I will admit that it's a possibility. From there, Kalish and Solomon suggest that it was very strange for Houdini to leave America in 1900, just as he was hitting it big. And so, they speculate that the main reason that Houdini went to England in that year was to work as a spy. Once in London, Houdini connected with William Melville. Now, an interesting thing about Melville is that part of his purview as the superintendent of Scotland Yard's Special Division was counter-espionage. Andrew Scott, Melville's biographer, has even called him Britain's first spy master. So, the thinking goes that Houdini went to London at the direction of the American Secret Service and then made contact with Melville at Scotland Yard. Houdini then spent the next 5 years touring Europe and sending reports back to Melville in London. In The Secret Life of Houdini, the authors guess that Houdini may have observed German war games and may have been secretly taking stock of the Kaiser's military. Houdini also toured Russia in those years, and the authors imply that he may have been feeding information about the court of the Tsar back to Scotland Yard. What evidence do Sloman and Kalish have of this? Well, they were able to get a copy of Melville's previously unreleased diary from the biographer Andrew Scott. In it, they found 2 entries, one from 1900 and one from 1902, where Melville notes that a report has come in from HH. But that's it. The whole Houdini was a spy theory rests on that. 2 vague entries in a diary that may or may not refer to Houdini. Now, as I already pointed out, the whole Scotland Yard story is clearly a myth. There is evidence that William Melville saw Houdini perform and was so taken by the act that he gave a glowing quote to a local paper. But beyond that, there isn't any clear evidence that Houdini and Melville ever met. Now, of course, it is very easy to imagine Houdini as a spy. After all, he was a master of locks, ciphers, secret codes, deception, and misdirection. He was a man who knew how to create an alias and keep secrets. Magicians really would make perfect spies. So it seems only fitting that the world's most famous magician also had to be a secret agent. Because if he wasn't, that would just be a missed opportunity, right? Personally, I would love it if Houdini had been a spy, because that would just be cool. But this entire line of conjecture is based on only the tiniest crumb of evidence. Now, I'm willing to leave the door open on this one because we may yet still learn more about this. But as for now, if someone tells you that Houdini was a spy, you should let them know that that's based on almost nothing. With all that said, by the summer of 1900, Houdini was performing regularly in Britain. His success at the Alhambra quickly led to engagements all over Europe. He seems to have been especially well received in Germany. This was in no small part because German was Houdini's first language, although it was a little rusty. The fact that he could perform his show in German helped, because a huge part of magic is storytelling. Over the next 5 years, Houdini and Bess would only return to America twice, and even then, just for quick family visits and vacations. Between the years 1900 and 1905, Houdini performed exclusively in Europe. Now, unlike the authors of The Secret Life of Houdini, I don't find it strange at all that Houdini took off for Britain in 1900. At the time, success in the UK and Europe simply had more prestige associated with it than success in America. Houdini even once told a British paper, quote, "I don't like America so well, even though I am a full-blooded American. When I reach England, I know it isn't America because there isn't graft there." End quote. By graft, Houdini was using slang that meant sneaky dealing or swindling. He was basically saying that America was full of hustlers, whereas the English were an honest sort. Now, it's very possible that he was just saying this to ingratiate himself with his British fans. I also love that even when Houdini was throwing a little shade in America's direction, he still reminded everyone that he was a, quote, full-blooded American. The all-American image was being preserved even when he said that he preferred England. When Houdini left America in 1900, he might have been able to call himself the best-known magician in the United States. When he finally returned to America in 1905, he was arguably the most famous entertainer in the world. Europe had embraced Harry Houdini, and now he was coming home as a conquering hero. After 5 years selling out theaters in London, Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg, Edinburgh, and everywhere in between, what else did Houdini have to prove? Well, as it would turn out, winning fame was one thing, but staying famous was a challenge all its own. For Houdini to stay on top, the act needed to get bigger, better, and more dangerous. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will conclude our look at Harry Houdini. Oh man, there's so much more still to talk about. Before we go this week, I need to give some special shout-outs. First, I want to give a shout-out to Noah Hightower, Petty Officer 2nd Class, on board the USS Seawolf. Hey Noah, say hi to your whole family for me. I need to give big ups to Biggie C89, to Tom Ramsey, to Emily Poppin, to Amy McKinley, to Samantha Mooney, to Melody Williams, to Jay Matthews, to Karen Bokeling, to Kenny Wayne, and to Rob Moore. All of these folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. I had to record these shoutouts a little bit earlier than usual, so if you didn't hear your name and you've recently pledged, just hang in there. I'm sure I will get to you in the next episode. If you think you want to support on Patreon, go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and look at the level of support that works for you. Patrons supporting at $3 or more should now have access to my new extra episode on Ancient Apocalypse, the ridiculous Graham Hancock show. So please check it out if you're curious about that. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Twitter at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory, or you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. The theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
Hi, this is Jillian. Those of us here at Court Junkie have a new podcast called Civil, where we dive into fascinating civil cases. Like in the case of a principal who took it upon himself to hypnotize students as a hobby. Then many of those students ended up dead. Or when a man was publicly and wrongfully accused of being the I-10 freeway shooter. We'll also be covering popular civil cases you've likely heard of. like O.J. Simpson and Alex Jones versus the parents of Sandy Hook.
This is AC. I have O.J. in the car.
Sandy Hook, it's got Inside Job written all over it.
Hosted by me, Jillian Jalali, researched by Nicole Gusmarati, and written by Matt Stroud and Nick Kepler. If you like following criminal trials like I do, I think you will love Civil. Subscribe to us now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.